Well, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you very much to ERF and to IDRC for the kind invitation. So my presentation is going to focus on what I'm calling from targets of charity to citizens. And this is really going to be looking at emerging lessons on gender-responsive social protection in Palestine. So in the presentation, I'm going to focus on the Palestinian case study because it's the MENA case study that I know best. But it's informed by two much larger multi-country, multi-regional studies which I've been involved in on gender-responsive social protection and also on citizens' perceptions of social assistance programs. So what I'd like to do is to begin by briefly reviewing some of the key concepts and thinking around gender and social protection linkages. Then I'm going to apply this framework to the Palestinian case to explore the extent to which Palestine's flagship national cash transfer program is promoting women's empowerment and gender equality and some of the real challenges involved there. And then I'll briefly conclude with some thoughts about possible entry points for future policy and programming. So at its most basic, social protection refers to actions taken in response to levels of vulnerability, risk, and deprivation, which are deemed socially unacceptable within a given society. So that's drawn from Norton et al., 2007. And by vulnerability, what we're really talking about is the susceptibility of individuals and households to the risk of a shock or stress. So as we all know, vulnerability is influenced by numerous factors, such as age, dependency ratios, ownership of assets, and access to resources. But perhaps most importantly, for our focus on gender, it's not just a factor of an individual or household's income levels, but it's shaped by a much broader and complex array of underlying structural socio-political factors. So, as Hani has emphasized, since the mid-1990s, social protection has risen really rapidly up the international political agenda as a poverty reduction approach. And indeed, by many, it's now seen as one of the key success stories of development interventions. Just to give you a sense of the scale of this revolution, cash transfer programs alone are now reaching over 750 million households globally, according to figures by DFID in 2013. What we see, though, is that globally, program design diverges considerably depending on the economic, social, and political context, and it's framed, again, as Hani has highlighted, through very different paradigms. In some contexts, the focus is on human development, and others on economic growth, and still others, child protection, or the ILO's Social Floor Initiative is highlighting citizen rights to basic welfare. And all of these different framings then have very different manifestations in terms of program design and implementation. I think despite this diversity, though, what's really clear is that generally speaking now, there's increasing interest in moving away from safety nets to what Stephen Devereux and Rachel Sabetes-Wheeler have famously dubbed towards more transformative social protection. Because increasingly, analysts have realized that cash alone is not enough to meaningfully transform the lives of the most marginalized and promote an exit from poverty. So, while social protection aims at targeting vulnerability, what's been particularly distinctive about the social protection revolution is that program design has been seldom informed by an understanding that vulnerabilities are inherently gendered. So instead, what we've seen is a real focus on targeting women. So most famously as the targets of conditional cash transfer programs in Latin America, and then in context where you have categorical targeting, then by focusing on female-headed households, assuming that they're most likely to be clustered amongst the poorest. So while this in itself is not problematic, it has, however, come at the cost of paying more explicit attention to how program design and implementation can promote gender equality and women's empowerment more broadly. And this is obviously key given what we know about the ways in which women, men, girls, and boys not only experience different types of risks, but also the ways in which they cope with the same risks and vulnerabilities differently. And this has been very eloquently highlighted by people such as Ruth Meinson-Dick and co-authors. So what we've tried to do in our work is to think about what a gender-responsive social protection might look like. And in a recent book I've written with Rebecca Holmes on Beyond Mothers and Safety Nets, what we've tried to highlight there is three key principles. Firstly, that gender inequality is a key and multidimensional source of vulnerability, and this has to be recognized in program designs, including the ways in which gendered vulnerabilities are embedded in broader structural socio-political environments. Secondly, that these risks and vulnerabilities are in turn then mediated through policy interventions, pre-existing political economy dynamics and social norms, again, all of which are gendered. And thirdly, that programs need to be not only tackling gendered vulnerabilities, but if they're to really achieve transformation and an exit from poverty, then focus also on the empowerment of girls and women at individual, household, community, and policy levels. And so that's what I'd like to focus on now in the Palestinian context. So in order to set the scene, I think it's important to begin by highlighting that MENA region countries have been much slower to embrace the rise of cash transfers seen in other parts of the globe. And as many of you will be aware, there's been a much stronger focus on retaining food and fuel subsidies. And I know that's something that those types of reforms that Egypt itself is now grappling with as well. So one of the reasons I think the Palestinian case is particularly worthy of attention is that within the region, the West Bank and Gaza are the only areas identified in Joanna Silver et al.'s 2013 World Bank report on social protection programs in the region, which showed that social safety net coverage in Palestine is above the world average. All the other programs in the MENA region are below the world average, and it's only in Palestine where you see that the social assistance programs, most notably the flagship National Cash Transfer Program, is covering more than half of the poorest quintile of the population. That being said, from a gender-responsive lens, Palestine's record is much more mixed, and that's what I'd like to focus on now. So, just very briefly to situate the Palestinian case study and our findings there, I think it is important to look at the broader political dynamics there facing social protection implementation. So on the one hand, what we see is both the Palestinian Authority and, to an extent, Hamas in the Gaza Strip have had a relatively strong track record in investing in human capital development through investments in basic health and education services. So Palestinians enjoy high scores on the Human Development Index relative to GDP per capita. However, as you'll all be aware, the West Bank and in particular the Gaza Strip face protracted economic crisis and a very severely truncated labor market due to the Israeli occupation and the international blockade on Gaza. Both territories are also very heavily donor dependent, and this shapes options for public expenditure. However, there has been a strong level of commitment by the Palestinian Authority and also by donors in maintaining expenditure on the cash transfer program over time. It's now equivalent to 1% of GDP. Then thinking about the gender profile of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, what's striking here is you see two very contrasting dimensions. On the one hand, investments in girls' access to basic health and education services have been very high, so we see much greater levels of gender parity in terms of access to education than for the other Arab states. Also, in terms of the Gender Development Index, which is assessed in terms of deviation from parity on the Human Development Index, Palestine ranks among one of the highest of the countries that the UNDP categorized as medium human development countries. By contrast, though, the picture is quite grim when we look at female labor participation, with Palestine having one of the lowest female participation labor rates in the world, at just 15.2% of women, and that this is then further reflected in a very low GNI per capita compared to men. So just $1,600 in purchasing power parity terms compared to $8,580 for men, which is again one of the lowest both globally and regionally. We also see very high, admittedly declining fertility rates, but still very high at over 4 births per woman compared to the regional average, which is just 2.7. So these are all based on 2014 figures. Okay, so turning now to the cash transfer program, which is at the heart of our study, I think it's important just to give you a snapshot of the program itself. So as I mentioned, its budget represents 1% of GDP, and it's jointly financed half by the Palestinian Authority and the rest by the World Bank and the EU. It's an amalgamation of a range of fragmented social assistance programs which were formed in 2010, and now all beneficiaries receive a quarterly transfer amount. Once they've registered, they're also eligible to free social health insurance, and for the poorest decile, educational subsidies and food aid. The targeting approach is based on a consumption-based proxy means test approach, but there's also some residue categorical targeted beneficiaries. Estimates are about 20 to 30,000 out of a total of some 170,000 households across the West Bank and Gaza. What's been particularly noteworthy about the program is that it has introduced a unified registry system, which means that every citizen, once they are registered on the program, then all the benefits and services to which in which they participate are all on a single database. So very critical in terms of promoting synergies and reducing duplication of effort by government and donor programs. And the other key thing is that in Palestine, there's been a big investment in terms of monitoring and evaluation of the effects of the program on multiple dimensions. So the World Bank's invested in looking at the targeting accuracy of the program, which show that the program is meeting gold standard in terms of its ability to avoid inclusion and exclusion errors. They've also, the EU has invested looking at the systems, UNICEF on child-specific impacts, and DFID on citizen perceptions of the way the program is being implemented in practice. So, I'm also not an economist, I'm a political scientist, and our methodology for this part of the study at least has been qualitative, although we do have a mixed methods component as well. So we have undertaken 2 rounds of fieldwork in 2011 and 2013, funded respectively by DFID and by UNICEF, and the work was undertaken with colleagues at Al-Quds University in Ramallah and in Gaza. So we employed a wide range of individual and group qualitative research instruments in 5 of the poorest governorates. In Gaza, it was in Bet Lahia in the north and Rafah in the south, and in the West Bank, it was in Jenin, Hebron, and the Jordan Valley. Okay, so now I'd like to share some of the findings. Starting with the impact on women's individual level empowerment, our findings suggest that the impacts have been mixed on women. So in terms of meeting what Maxime Molyneux has famously termed women's practical gender interests, there have been definitely strong effects in terms of improved household consumption and nutrition, including covering the costs for disabled family members' needs, such as medical needs and assistive devices. There's been an improved uptake of basic education and health services, and women also universally reported an improved sense of self-confidence, particularly in terms of their relationships with their in-laws and with male family members, brothers and fathers. However, There have been more limited effects on women's more strategic gender interests, and in particular, again, reflecting very much what Hania was talking about, very limited impacts in terms of enhancing women's income generating capacities. So as I mentioned before, women's labor force participation is exceedingly low, but the cash transfer has not provided any links to complementary initiatives focusing on labor market entry, skills building, or even microcredit. So there's been no learning there from some of the other programs in Latin America, such as in Chile and Brazil, where you do see some of those linkages. Similarly, there's also been very limited access for women to psychosocial support. So in other contexts, often there's a social worker that mediates the relationship between the cash transfer beneficiaries and the program. And while there is as well in Palestine, the social workers we interviewed universally complained that they had excessive caseloads and no time to listen to women's problems. So particularly women who are suffering from gender-based violence in the home or restrictions on their mobility imposed by male family members found that they had no support through the program in that way, compared to other contexts where you have a higher ratio of social workers to beneficiaries, where there have been some of those more positive spillover effects. Okay, so this is just to give you a flavor, though, of some of the, the real sense of individual empowerment that some of the women told us about. So just to give you a couple of examples, one woman, a female-headed household in Jenin, said that the cash transfer protects us from begging and burdening our families. And another in Gaza explained it as the cash transfer program is like first aid that resuscitates the victim. Women like us would be lost without it. And we heard these sentiments expressed again and again. However, when you look at intra-household empowerment, here we saw relatively limited impacts on women's care work burden. So there's a universal view amongst beneficiaries that the transfer amount is inadequate given the scale of needs and the escalating scale of needs in Gaza, in particular following the repeated conflict episodes. However, they did report that the transfer does provide some opportunity to provide treats for their children and does allow, when they receive the payment, some leisure opportunities as families, which was highly valued by participants. We also found some, but limited evidence that intra-household violence had been reduced because of lessened stress around livelihood insecurity, but that was primarily in the relationships between children and parents, rather than the relationships, in this case, between women and men. But we found in general that the effect on women's care burden, which are obviously very high given the high average fertility rates, and in the families we were talking to, some families had up to 18 children, so really huge families. I would say on average, while the national average in Palestine is about 4.1, I think ours was 8 children per family. So this was particularly problematic in families with disabled family members who tend to be disproportionately clustered as beneficiaries, and also because you find in Palestine higher average rates of disability due to conflict, but also due to a trend of consanguineous marriages. Unlike in other programs, so for example, programs in Peru or the 4Ps program in the Philippines, there's also no behavioral change communication component to try and shift some of these gender norms around care burdens. So in some programs, cash transfer programs, there are then awareness raising sessions, behavioral change, sort of community dialogues trying to focus on shifting some of these norms around who's responsible for care, and partly because of some of the critiques of the conditional cash transfers where the burden has been very much focused on women, but there's none of this within the Palestinian program. Similarly, and again in contrast to some of the Latin American programs, particularly in Brazil and Chile, there's no linked either legal awareness or legal aid component. which is critical for particularly deserted women who may lack access to divorce papers that are needed in order to be entitled to get the benefit, and also no support for women living in polygamous households to help them also negotiate the system, which is not built with second and third wives in mind, even though many of the women we talked to were in fact in polygamous relationships. So here I just wanted to capture some of the sense of the care burdens that women are facing that have not been addressed through the program to date. This is again from a woman in a refugee camp in Jenin, and she argued that we tried to take our disabled son to get help, but no organization accepted him. I'm ready to work outside my home to make a better living for my children, but I cannot leave my son alone. This lack of care options really limits my chances of employment and mobility. This is why we have to make do with assistance from the cash transfer. So it's a sense of, yes, it's providing a Band-Aid, but it's not transforming their lives because they're not thinking about the broader range of vulnerabilities which women are facing. So turning now to community-level empowerment, here we also found relatively weak evidence of community-level spillover effects from program participation. Part of it is because the way the program itself is designed is not really focused on changing community-level behavior. It's much more focused on the household unit, and this is one of the sort of the universal shortcomings, I think, of the cash transfer model. However, in Palestine, this is then further exacerbated by the payment mechanism. So in Palestine, the beneficiaries just go to the bank individually and collect the benefit on a quarterly basis. And so there is not a payment day that you see in some of the other programs in Latin America or Africa, which also serves as a really important opportunity for beneficiaries to interact with each other and share experiences, but also to interact with program implementers. But on the payment days in the West Bank and Gaza, there's no one from the program there. So it's a very individual relationship, which needs to be rethought. Also, the transfer is not really doing anything to address women's social isolation, which is really a very key problem given the occupation-related mobility constraints and then also the cultural constraints on women's movement, particularly within Gaza. As one woman from Gaza lamented in a very poignant way, she explained, "We're under the eyes of our society. People observe us wherever we move. They want us to be prisoners in our homes. It's an unbelievable culture. When a young woman is divorced or becomes a widow, she's expected to stop doing everything. But we have the right to live normal lives." And then there were also some, but relatively limited, complaints about stigmatization of beneficiaries by non-beneficiaries within some communities. And this was particularly because the information flows about the way the program is targeted. Previously it was categorical, focused on widows or orphans, etc. Now it's focused on a proxy means test, poverty targeting approach, which people don't really understand. So there's misinformation and suspicion in some communities around that. On a more positive note, though, we did find evidence of enhanced social capital amongst family members and neighbors. So a number of women really highlighted the way that it enhanced their ability to participate in family and community events like birthdays or weddings, and in turn had enabled them to also regain respect within the community such that they could then secure informal credit. So while they don't have access to formal credit markets, at least they could borrow from neighbors or shopkeepers because there's a sense that, okay, a payment will be coming in the next quarter. But none of this sort of social capital was then translating into broader collective action, which again is a shortcoming. Then finally, looking at the fourth level of empowerment, in terms of political empowerment of women, the evidence was really the weakest here. So our starting point was to draw on literature by participation experts such as Ros Eben and Bekenya, who have argued that if social programs are to enhance state legitimacy vis-a-vis the citizens, then it's really important to assess not just what is provided, but whether citizens are treated with dignity during that process. So our findings in Palestine indicated that information provision about program reforms for beneficiaries and to the wider communities had been very weak. And even the subnational social workers who have to interface with the communities had not really been explained in an accessible way, the targeting mechanisms and the rules and regulations on who was eligible to which part of the additional benefits, the health insurance and the food aid, etc. We also found that feedback channels between program implementers and communities were relatively weak, despite the potential of a trained social work cadre. But as I mentioned before, the social workers are so overburdened that they don't have time to really engage in meaningful conversations with beneficiaries. They're too busy ticking, do you still have a fridge, do you have a TV, etc. And obviously there's confusion there with remittance-related items in the household as well. I think what's interesting, though, about the Palestinian context compared to many of the other countries that we looked at and that really could be exploited or harnessed by the program is that there is a comparatively strong rights-based culture in Palestine. There's a very active civil society, and citizens are willing to make their views heard. It's just not clear to them how that can be done, and the grievance mechanisms, there were the complaints that none of those had really been adequately followed up. But I think some of these quotes here highlight the sense of rights and entitlement with which beneficiaries view the program. So an older female beneficiary in Jenin argued, "This is better than a handout, this is my right." And then saying it to a bank official, "You must pay me this until I'm dead. This is my right, you do not pay it from your pockets." And similarly in Hebron, another younger female beneficiary said that the benefit is our right. In Israel, people get X and Y. Here we barely get a thing. They take it from us. They don't give us anything. There's just 10 meters between me and the Arabs in Israel, but they're living a much better life than me. This benefit is our right. So, but again, there is a bit of a silver lining within the program, which I think is very exciting and something which we're trying to explore in upcoming research, which is the ministry, in response to these findings about this really strong demand from beneficiaries to have more meaningful interaction with program implementers, is that there's now a pilot initiative being run by the Ministry of Social Affairs together with DFID funding to organize beneficiaries into government-wide beneficiary fora. So people are invited to participate in these forums to articulate their concerns directly to local but also national program implementers, to exchange information but then provide recommendations on what or what isn't working in terms of district or governorate specific implementation. In these beneficiary fora to date, there's been gender parity and participation, although we did hear reports that in practice, men tend to be dominating the dialogue. But I think overall, there's strong potential for transformation. And again, just a couple of quotes to highlight this. So one of the women we talked to in Gaza had this to say. So in Gaza, they haven't yet piloted the program. And she argued, there are no places where we can raise our voices and speak up. It would be great if these places existed. But we would need people there to be in a position to help us, people in charge who could decide and provide us with the things we really need. Now, by contrast, one of the women I just talked to in the West Bank in August, who's now a participant in one of these fora, had this to say. Before I was lost, I had no voice. Now I know I have rights and that I have a voice. Even if my own problems with the ministry are solved, this will be the last thing I give up, is this committee. I need to fight for the rights of vulnerable people like us, and especially the rights of my disabled daughter. Okay, so just to conclude very quickly, I think what's clear from the Palestinian experience is you do have a very solid program in place. It's targeting the very poorest, and it has a high level of coverage, and a relatively high level of commitment both by the government and the donors. However, I think the question we need to grapple with now is how could cash transfer programs like this better engage with women and support them to become empowered citizens rather than the targets of handouts or charity. So I just have two key recommendations. The first, I think, is to consider the learning that we have in other regions. I think particularly the Brazilian Bolsa Familia program and the Chile Solidario program provide great lessons in terms of what's called a cash plus model, which is really about providing tailored support and then linkages to complementary services. So in Palestine, this would need to include linkages to economic empowerment initiatives for women, the psychosocial support, legal awareness, so to help, and legal aid to help overcome gender discriminatory practices that are hindering the uptake of the benefit, disability support services, and equally importantly, safe spaces for women to meet and exchange their experiences and information. And then finally, I think it's critical to evaluate this current pilot on the beneficiary fora. Initial signs are very promising, but this would be a concrete way to try and enhance women's voices to both local and national policymakers and program implementers, but also then to improve program feedback loops and ultimately service provider accountability. Thanks very much.